And I'm very pleased that we can have Frank Ledwidge here. And obviously I'm going to big him up. And we've got a very, very long biography, which I'm literally going to read, Frank, if that's all right. So we're going to talk about British military failure over the last 10 years. I know Frank's got some very, very strong opinions about that. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to hearing what he's got to say. We've been nattering already, and I know that he's fired up and ready to launch himself on this subject. So let's talk about Frank for a bit. He's 15 years a reservist in naval intelligence. Frank Ledwidge served frontline operational tours in Bosnia, Kosovo and Iraq, the latter as head of one of the joint service multinational teams looking for WMD. He was subsequently selected to head his service specialisation for 2 years. He's a graduate of the Joint Service Command and Staff College and has worked closely with US and other NATO forces. He has passed the US Marine Counterintelligence course. He retired from the service in early 2009. In civilian life, he's an Oxford Law graduate and barrister. He has worked for many years throughout the Balkans and former Soviet Union in the field of conflict prevention for the OSCE and the British government. In 2007, he combined his military and civilian roles as the first civilian justice advisor to the UK task force in Helmand. His academic work on human rights, Afghanistan and insurgency has appeared regularly in print and online. Just to show that he's got a nice big beefy book, which of course will be available via Amazon and all good bookshops, and if you want to get it cheaper at Amazon. So no doubt he'll be very pleased to if you go and buy one. So anyway, we're going to kick this off 45 minutes, and then some questions at the end. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. It's very good to be here, and thank you for coming. The talk you're going to get today is pretty much the talk that I gave the initial command and staff course at Shribben. So how many of you are here? About 10, 20, about 30 odd people. There's about 200 on that course. They're all junior majors, senior captains on promotion in their early 30s. So you're going to have pretty much a very similar talk to them. And the reason I mention that is because what surprised me in giving this talk, and we can reflect on that if you like afterwards, if any of you want to raise this, is the response that I got. Now, you'll appreciate pretty quickly as we go into this talk that I'm not entirely praising, I'm not in the business of praising what the British military have been doing over the last decade. And I expected a great deal of pushback, chest poking, criticism, hostility even, from my former military colleagues. Over the last 3 years since this, or 2.5 years since this book's been published that Matt mentioned, please sit down. I haven't had any hostility at all for any of these people, okay? Particularly not those with combat experience or with operational experience. Nobody at all. Much of what you're going to hear tonight is culled from, because I'm not particularly bright, I'm no theorist, I'm no international relations specialist. Most of you will have far higher IQs than me, as you will appreciate fairly quickly. But most of what you are going to hear was culled from military officers with combat experience in Iraq, Afghanistan and other theatres. Not all of those people, for what it counts or matters, it doesn't really, will agree with everything I said. But the point I want to make is that what you're going to hear now is not off-the-wall, critical, hostile, considered anti-military by the people who are the subject of this talk. It was a big surprise to me. Okay, so where does all this come from? The central thesis of what you're going to hear tonight is that the campaigns that, and none of it will come as any surprise to you, many of you will agree with it, the central thesis is that the campaigns we've fought in Iraq, who remembers Iraq now, and Helmand, were badly fought, politically ill-founded, strategically illiterate, and have failed. There is nothing that we have achieved in either place, count it nothing, my contention, that reflects credit on our presence there. And we can discuss that afterwards if you like, and perhaps go into some detail. I'd like to move back a couple of years now. Occasionally when I have to, I go into London. And I was on the tube about two years ago, coming down one of those steps, you know, in the underground in London. And there were two people who were taking a pram with a baby down some steps. And, you know, you pass, this happens all the time, right? So, passed them on the steps and looked to my right down, saw the little baby in the pram. And for some reason, I had a little bit of a flashback, which of course anyone can get. And the flashback that I had, and I hadn't thought of this since I'd been there in Helmand in 2007. I was a civilian in the Lashkargah Provincial Reconstruction Team. It was basically a fort in the middle of the city of Lashkargah, on the edge actually, next to the cemetery appropriately enough. And so the headquarters of the British presence in Helmand. And one day I was wandering around, heading to the gate, I think, to meet somebody. And one of the medics ran in front of me, about as far away as the back row there. Just ran. You don't often see soldiers running. It's a hot day. She's carrying something, blankets, streaked with brown, red. So she ran across, running from the gate to the where some buildings and offices are. And so I walked on, met whoever it was at the gate, and carried on with my day. And the next morning, we had a briefing on significant action, SIG Acts they're called. You'll be familiar with those if you've read WikiLeaks. And the SIG Acts of the day included a negligent discharge, which is an accidentally fired round at a roadblock. And what had happened at this roadblock is that there'd been a crowd of people, regularly happens in Helmand, waiting in a queue, and one of the soldiers had failed to put the safety catch on his rifle, discharged around ricocheted, and it had struck the head of a baby. It was that baby that the medic was carrying with a big hole in its head as I approached the gate. Now, I mention that because it, apart from the psychological interest to me personally, it set me going, set me thinking on the tube that day. And one began to think in the following terms, that we all, who here, is anybody here been in the Army or the Navy, the Air Force, any, right? When we joined the military, as I did in the early 90s, we think we're going to be the good guys, right? When we went to the Balkans, we were the good guys. We were definitely there to help. I spent 2 years chasing war criminals in the Balkans rather successfully. And we have this self-image that that's how other people see us too. But it isn't the case. And having had this flashback, I can't remember if the parents were South Asian or it doesn't matter. You know, what was it that gave that flashback? But it got me thinking about perspectives. Because in neither of the places that I served in the last decade, I was a soldier in Iraq, where I was part of a team called the Iraq Survey Group looking for weapons of mass destruction. It's a story we can tell later if you like. And in Helmand as a justice advisor. In neither of those places do I perceive us as the good guys. Okay, so let's get started. No End of a Lesson. It's from a Kipling poem from 1903. Why do you think Kipling was writing, anybody, about learning lessons in 1900? That's actually 1901. 1901. Boer War, right? And he's talking about the British Army having had no end of a lesson at that point. And Matt and I were discussing the results of that kind of consideration applied to the lessons of the Boer War, which is a real failure from the British perspective, which were turned into the Isha reforms and the Haldane reforms, and which provided the basis for the British Army just being able, just in time, to hold off the Germans at Mons and so on exactly 100 years ago. Just shy of 100 years ago. And they learned their lesson up to a point. They identified the fact they failed badly. They were defeated essentially, certainly defeated in the field. They did something about it. We've had no end of a lesson. And as a business people should, Kipling said, we should learn our lessons. And I suggest that's the case now. So let's get into it. First of all, Basra. I arrived in Basra. Were you guys, any of you guys in Iraq? Right. Yes?
I'm from Iraq.
You're from Iraq?
Or the south, Iraq, not you.
Okay, well I was in the south.
Yeah.
Right. Kurdistan's a different story, of course. But in the south, we arrived 2003. When I got there, it was about 4 or 5 months into the mission. And we were out every day on patrol, beginning to take casualties from IEDs, the odd shooting, usually grenades, but not too much, you know. The week I got there, we went on patrol, and people literally threw flowers at us. Well, I couldn't believe it. Well, this only happens in films, right? About the liberation of France. No, throwing flowers at us, little kids. If kids are throwing flowers at you, it's a good thing, right? If you're on patrol, kids are throwing flowers at you, it means that they are hearing good things from their parents. This is we felt good at that time. But it didn't take long for things to deteriorate. And they deteriorated because, I'll go into detail if anybody wants it, what we hadn't appreciated was our enemy, insofar as there was an enemy in Basra, was not Saddamite dead-enders or Al-Qaeda foreign fighters. The only foreign fighters in Basra where we were ourselves. We were the biggest and the best armed gang in Basra and behaved in that way. We did not behave in a way that spoke of strategic coherency. And as a result, those who did have strategic coherency, in this case in Basra, Shia militias, began to take control. And I remember, just by way of anecdote, and as I said, I'm not a particularly theoretical person, so please forgive the sort of empirical anecdotal approach to some of this. We turned up one day at a school in the fringes of Basra. We were looking for some biologist, I think, to interview him about WMD. Yeah, I'll put that aside. And so there we were, milling about outside, little cordon, and some of the kids came out, young students, late teens, said, "Great, thanks, we are here to protect us." We were armed to the teeth, of course. We said, "What do you mean?" "You're here to protect us from these thugs who are coming in, and making the women wear the abayas and the men behave in an Islamic fashion. We'd like you to protect us from these. We don't need them here." I said, "Sorry, we're not here for that. We're here to find X, Y, Z." And off we drove. And that was the beginning of the creeping dominance of the Shia militias, who were or became the real threat to British forces and to order in southern Iraq on a much wider level, and indeed through Iraq nationwide, save for Kurdistan. We hadn't appreciated what was going on, and it got so bad eventually, took years, and I'm cutting through a whole swathe of detail now, that in the end Basra had to be liberated from these Shia militias by the Iraqi army, not the British army. Insofar as there was any foreign involvement, it was American, and the British presence was being mentored by that American military incursion into Basra alongside the 2 Iraqi army divisions who liberated Basra. We were not involved, it got that bad. Basra, a failure. But that's not the way the top brass see it. Just have a read of that. We did all brilliantly. We intended for this to happen. We worked things so cleverly that it looked like a complete cock-up. But in fact, it was a brilliant plan. It was a cunning plan on our part. Air Chief Marshal Sir Jock Stirrup was Chief of the Defence Staff at the time, and therefore may be considered to have some responsibility for this. So it's understandable he has a certain perspective, all right? Colonel Tim Collins has another perspective. He's an infantry commander. He's the guy that made that Shakespearean-style speech before the invasion, saying they were coming to liberate, and that if we kill anybody, it's because we really love them. But anyway, you'll see that President Bush had it on the wall. It was a very good speech, and I think, in essence, a very decent man. But whether it is or not, that's the perspective of many of the middle-ranking tactical commanders in our army. So Helmand, let's think about Helmand a second. Anybody from Afghanistan?
I've said that.
You served there. Were you infantry?
Yeah. Well, I was attached to the Gurkhas, yeah.
Okay. When were you there?
2011.
Okay. Right. Well, just before the entry into Helmand in 2006, we sent a team. We, the British, sent a team to Helmand. The British Department for International sent a team. There's another anecdote coming up now. We sent a team with copies of the Blue Planet DVD series. And two women, and it's relevant that they're women, toured the province of Helmand, which is about the same size as Bosnia or Northern Ireland. Exactly the same size as Bosnia, give or take 100 square kilometres. These villages, surrounded by tribal militias run by the governor, who we subsequently deposed. So they toured the province with copies of the Blue Planet. And they projected them onto the walls of the houses in the province. And you'll have seen, we call them compounds, villages, to show them how British culture can be. No one was killed. When the first deployment, this is where they link up with the Gurkhas a little bit actually here, when the first deployment took place the following year, there had been a reconnaissance by Special Forces and Royal Marines prior to the entry into Helmand in 2006. They'd been there a year before, around the time they were showing the Blue Planet. And they'd said there's no insurgency in Helmand now, but you can have one if you want one. That was the central message of the Special Forces and Royal Marines mission. And the first unit into this particularly traditional and conservative part of the world, it's probably the most religiously conservative part of Asia, actually. Certainly the most religiously conservative part of Central Asia, South Central Asia. It is a place that Kabulis, people from Kabul, regard as the back of beyond. There was no insurgency when we got there. I'll come to Helmand with a few more details in a moment. But there was a briefing to the airborne brigade. 3,000 men were going in. To the effect that everything was fine. There was no insurgency, and in fact, said the Foreign Office briefer to the officers of the first units into Helmand, in fact, it was so safe that we had a team going around showing the Blue Planet, and no one was killed. That's great. One officer put his hand up and said, "Excuse me, you mentioned the Blue Planet, and that's great, but isn't there something called the Battle of Maiwand that happened in Helmand? And that, caveat the fact, or notwithstanding the fact that you showed the Blue Planet around the villages of Helmand, the truth is that we are rather hated in that part of the world, and that their memories go back a bit longer than ours." That his suggestion was dismissed. No, you're wrong. People don't remember that kind of thing. It was an awful long time ago. That officer was a helicopter pilot. 3 months later, he was the pilot who managed to put up enough support to stop a platoon of about 30 Gurkhas, infantrymen, being killed, every one, by this insurgency that had not existed before we got there. It was that very pilot. And what was he talking about? Battle of Maiwand, have any of you heard, apart from you at the backs, you should have heard of that, have any of you heard of the Battle of Maiwand? Yeah, put your hand up if you heard of the Battle of Maiwand. Who's heard of Isandlwana? Isandlwana against the Zulus, same year, just the year before, 1880. Along with that, and several defeats against the Boers, this was one of the 3 or 4 major defeats the British Army had ever suffered in the 19th century. And they suffered it at the hands of an Afghan army. Not the kind of ragtaggle set of ambushes that constituted the battle in the Defiles in 1842. A straight-up, stand-up battle between a British brigade of 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers and an Afghan brigade of a similar number, slightly more actually, but not significantly more. And the battle was won, say the Afghans, and it doesn't matter how it actually was won actually by artillery. But the battle was won, say the Afghans, because there was a young woman, and you'll know her name, Malalai, led the Afghan troops who were wavering in front of the fire of the British volleys, stopped the retreat and said, "Follow me," or was the effect, "Follow me, men of the south, into martyrdom." She was killed, many of them were killed, but they smashed the British brigade. It resonates so strongly in Helmand, even now, that I met a paratrooper who was patrolling through one of the towns of Helmand, and he was asked, "Why are you people back again?" He said, "We've not been here before." "Well, you have. You've been here. Last time you were here, you burned our bazaar." He said, "We didn't burn the bazaar. Perhaps a few bombs fell in the wrong place, but we didn't burn your bazaar. You came here in 1880 and you burned our bazaar, and you're back and you're going to pay for it," he was told. Okay, so the point is, all the histrionics, deep historical resonance. It is literally the worst place, with the arguable exception of the Bogside in Londonderry, to send a force of British paratroopers to quell an insurgency which didn't at the time exist. There we go, you had that. So that's the sort of political, historical background, massively simplified. It's very complex, obviously, and if anybody's interested, we can go into detail on that in the book. But there's also a strategic problem, because that British military presence had no objective. And indeed, when I got sent to Helmand in 2007, 2008, I wasn't particularly clear on what we were doing. Okay, so why is that the responsibility of the military? Surely that's a political responsibility. And I contend that that's true, it is. And none of what I say absolves the politicians from what they should have done. But it is incumbent on commanders to ensure that there is adequate strategic guidance before and during a mission, because strategy, as you know, shifts and changes and morphs as campaigns proceed. It's not static. Objectives shift and change, we understand that. But at no point did any senior British commander insist from his political chain of command on having guidance, as General Templer did in 1952. I dug that out of one of the archives, one of the volumes of communications in 1952. You don't have to be going around through the archives to know that traditionally British commanders, if they didn't have adequate guidance, asked for it. He was talking about Malaya, which of course is much trumpeted as a counterinsurgency success. That's not relevant for the moment, we'll come back to that in a minute. But enough to say that insofar as Malaya was a success, it was because everybody was clear on what the objectives were, at the political, the operational and the tactical level. But of course, we knew what the strategy was, didn't we? You will know that because you will have been told, as I was, we are conducting counterinsurgency. COIG. It's such a term of science that it has its own little acronym that everybody, it's not even an acronym, it's a contraction, counterinsurgency. That's the strategy we're using, counterinsurgency, because it's worked all that time in the past in Malaya, and we did it in Northern Ireland as well, and we are the finest counterinsurgency army in the world, and I'm quoting here, the finest counterinsurgency army in the world. So if there is any insurgencies that we kick off, because we have, in the words of the ambassador to Afghanistan, poked a sleeping lion, we'll be able to sort it out and handle it. That may work conceptually if you accept that counterinsurgency exists as a strategy. And of course, as all of you will know, this is no strategy. It's simply a military approach at best, a selection as Major Few, an American officer who takes part in the far more vibrant intellectual discourse of the US military than in our own, will say to you that it is nothing more than a strategy of tactics. Show me where it ever worked. And that's a big challenge. So we didn't have a strategy. A strategy, of course, is a political animal, is it not? But we also didn't have the most, even on the, if you accept counterinsurgency as a theorem or as a strategy, or indeed as a set of tactics that can work, you need to be working to a political objective, do you know? And in order to have that, you need to have a government. Now, Afghanistan's government, I'll come back to that in a moment. Afghanistan's government is the most corrupt government in the world by the objective standards of Transparency International. The only two that compare are Somalia, which doesn't have a government, and North Korea, which they've not been able to assess. 179th on a list of 181, and 102 below are only there because A, Afghanistan comes first, Alpha, Somalia and North Korea. It's the most corrupt country in the world. And we are starting from a basis where, unlike even if you accept Malaya and these other shibboleths as successes, Northern Ireland, in all of these places there were fine governments which by any standards were working and functioning. Afghanistan's does not function even today. Nothing like it. Never has, arguably. Except, well, it's arguable, but there we are. It certainly doesn't now. And of course that government has to be legitimate. And we know the legitimacy problems that the Afghan government has even now. But, you know, strategy can morph, and that's one thing. Strategy can shift and change. But having a different strategy every year is something different, something else entirely, a different approach. And certainly since 2006, both at the high level ISAF, that is the international military presence, and the British level, we have had different approaches every year. At the tactical level, where soldiers are deployed, British soldiers are deployed, we change commanders with different command priorities every 6 months. So it's very difficult to select and maintain an aim, which is the first principle of war, that every young officer should learn, or indeed every non-commissioned officer or every soldier should learn, if you're not capable of sustaining that. That's the selection and the maintenance part. There's no objective anyway. Even if there is, you need to maintain that, and our deployment cycles are not conducive to that, being 6 monthly. So in other words, you get a recycling of every single soldier every 6 months. Each commander, 1-star general, each commander with different command priorities. And they will tell you that. The command priority for this mission, for our deployment, you'll have been told this if you were briefed by the brigadier, is info ops, is whatever. Every commander has different tactical and operational priorities. They will say, of course, it's within a consistent strategy. That is simply untrue. I showed this to the soldiers at the officers at Shrivenham, which is our staff college where officers go to get trained to become better staff officers. I asked them, what's this? Where's that from? Nobody could tell me. It's actually the ISAF strategy. That's the strategy to which the International Security Assistance Force, that's the international force in Afghanistan, works. You will identify as anyone else would. This is no strategy. It's a set of impossible aspirations. That is no strategy. Impossible aspirations. Okay, so that's the strategic and political side to both by the way, everything I've said applies both to Iraq, less so to Iraq actually, the higher levels where the Americans were operating, but certainly in Basra, and absolutely in southern Afghanistan. I'm sorry, please forgive me, I'm making certain assumptions about knowledge which perhaps are inappropriate or wrong concerning Afghanistan. I know that you had an excellent seminar a few weeks ago, but I'm presuming you know that southern Afghanistan is Pashtun, so from the north, it's an extremely complex country. So we'll put that aside and we can chat about that later on in the seminar. But we now come to organic problems and organisational problems within the British military. There are the deployment issues, 6 monthly cycles, lack of strategic approach, lack of link of that strategic approach with any political objective, or indeed any political means or guidance. There's also a cultural difficulty. Those of us who, anybody who does any military training at initial level, be they young lieutenants, second lieutenants who command 20 or 30 people, corporals who command 9 or 10 people, it's important, vital, as an army or a land officer, a military officer, to understand that if you're taking casualties and you've been given an objective, you just don't stop. It is not the mark of a successful military organisation to stop if things are going a bit wrong, unless you're ordered to do so. You crack on and finish what you started. You've selected the aim, maintain it and carry on to the end. Crack on. If you're tired, get up, chin up, move on. And that's fine if you're a young officer, if you're very junior. But it's no good if you're a general. The cracking on idea, which is central to British military culture, is not appropriate for generals advising politicians. As the Iraq inquiry revealed, our generals to have advised our politicians. Success is achievable, we just need to press on. That's what they were all told. It's entirely right for young officers to have that approach. It's entirely wrong for senior officers to take that approach, because it gives rise to an unrealistic approach to what's going on. And indeed, I would contend, what it gives rise to are people telling senior officers what they want to hear, because not to do so is not cracking on. Sorry, I missed something out there. Okay, that's why officers are told we don't want to hear, and they are, we don't want to hear negativity. You need to understand that matters are going to proceed according to plan. It may not look like that to you. Let me give you an example from someone of my own acquaintance who commanded a platoon of 29 people in 2010. It was a very dangerous period of, it's all dangerous for infantrymen, always dangerous, but in this period, particularly high casualties. We've taken, now his platoon, 29 people, including himself, took 14 people killed or injured, seriously injured. I'm talking about having lost legs and things like that. And not just grazed with shrapnel. So 14 of his men are killed or seriously injured. And he, of course, every day would be sending up reports to the next level, which is a company level. So he's at platoon level, he goes up to the company, 100 men. And you go, as you know, basically up increments of 10 through brigade and so on. So the report goes up. Our GDAs, our ground domination activity, and a euphemism for patrolling in the army, is failing. We're taking casualties and achieving them. So that's the report he'll send out as a young officer. Brave young officer, in every sense, morally brave. That will be changed, he told me, by the time it gets up to the level of his battalion, which is 700 to 1,000 people, his battle group, it'll be changed to there's serious difficulties, but progress is being made. Now, no battle group commander is wanting to come across as a naysayer or a failure merchant, especially not a brigade, and certainly no brigade commander wants to hear that kind of stuff. So when it gets to brigade, what's happening at the GDA level, the ground domination activity across the province of Helmand, the 5 or 10,000 people who are actually doing the work, is that yes, there are difficulties. But you know what? We're pressing on and we will prevail. So the higher up the report goes, the more diluted it is in terms of reality. Until you get politicians saying that Afghanistan is a far better place for our presence. And we should be proud of what we achieved there. We should be proud, I contend, of what our soldiers have done at the tactical level, because they've done what they are told to do, and I'm talking the very low level now, extremely well, as with our American and other allies. But the results don't warrant the efforts. Where are we there? Leadership, yes, and accountability. We have more senior officers in the British Armed Forces than any other major force in the world, per capita. The US Marine Corps has a fighting force, or a complement, of about 250,000, 240,000 people. It's the most effective fighting arm in the world, bar none. Okay? It has its own army, it's got its own air force, it's even got part of a little navy of its own as well, actually, the US Marines. It's the same size as the British Armed Forces. It's far more combat capable, with the exception of the submarines that they don't have. And they have 80 generals. Okay? Now, by generals, I'm talking about 1 star and above, because we don't call brigadiers generals, but they do. 80 generals. We have a full complement in our armed forces of about 210,000. Now it's going down. 210,000. We have 450 generals. The US Marine Corps recently fired 2 of its generals because, I didn't need to go into the details, but basically what happened was a British base guarded by British assets. You will have been there at that time, 2011, when they did for the Harriers. Were you there then?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right? So it's Camp Bastion, a British base, Taliban commando unit got into the base, destroyed an entire flight of American Harriers worth, worth a lot of money, but a major asset. Killed a couple of Americans, and then they were all killed. Shouldn't have happened. Okay? And the US Marine Corps recognised that, so they fired 2 generals who were responsible. This was a British base. How many British officers have been fired over the rank of colonel since 2003? Answer no. By the way, similar things happened in Iraq to the Americans over the last decade as well. Go into detail if you want. We have no command, or our command integrity does not extend to taking responsibility for failure to the extent that you will either resign or you will fire your immediate subordinates. And by that I'm talking about very senior officers. We simply don't do it. Let me give you an example though. Who do you fire? Right? The Iraq inquiry, at the Iraq inquiry, nobody below the rank of Major General, I don't want to get into these general ranks because they're very confusing, but enough to say quite senior officers, was allowed to give evidence. So very senior generals gave evidence to the Iraq inquiry. 35 generals gave evidence to the Iraq inquiry. Serving generals. 35. Who's responsible then? Who do you fire? Who do you discipline? Who do you report badly on when your responsibility is diluted down to that extent? It's far, far worse in Afghanistan. Far, far more than 35 generals have been involved in Afghanistan. And what about quality? We lose, I contend, most of our best officers at the level where they become very senior. That is to say, the difference between a colonel rank and a brigadier rank. Most of our best people leave at that point. The people who are promoted, I won't say they're yes men, I won't say they're company men, because that's not entirely true, and I don't want to mischaracterise them. Some of them are outstanding people, some of them. But we lose a huge proportion of our best officers at that level, with the result that we don't have the quality of senior officers commensurate with the people they command. And that is historically not unusual for the British Army, particularly the Army. You can see here General Alan Brooke. Does anybody know who General Alan Brooke was? General Brooke. Field Marshal Brooke, actually, as he became. Okay, he basically commanded the British Armed Forces in the Second World War. And that's what he said. He was constantly firing generals for losing battles, for failing properly to staff their campaigns, for making stupid decisions. Constantly firing at all levels. But he could get no better. That was 1942. Things are better now, right? This is a little bit more recent. Now, Andrew Mackay was one of the more successful commanders in Helmand. He's an excellent man. He takes this view. And he's talking about generals, his brethren. You won't be surprised to hear that he resigned in January 2012. Okay, that's what they used to do. Anybody know who this is? Not you, Matt. Anybody know who this is? Does anybody know the phrase, who's French here? Anybody? Encourager les autres. Voltaire said that, and he was to encourage the others. And he was talking here about Admiral Byng, who was shot by a Royal Marine firing squad in 1743, I think, for failing to take the island of Minorca. Now, the truth is that there was no way he was going to take the island of Minorca. his ships were rotten, his men all had scurvy and yellow fever. I think it was yellow fever. Anyway, the guns were broken. But they shot him because he didn't try. And some people, by the way, put the execution of this admiral at the heart of the Royal Navy's subsequent success. Because the very colonel, until very recently in the Royal Navy, even when I was doing my training as a young Navy officer, engage the enemy more closely. Get alongside your enemy, get stuck in, crack on, as the army would say. Now that ethos only really came to the fore during the American Wars of Independence and the Napoleonic Wars, of course. Some say because nobody wanted to end up like Admiral Bingham. So that's how we used to deal with our failing officers. Unfortunately, we don't deal with that, like that. I say unfortunately, perhaps that's going a bit far. And unfortunately, we don't apply any kind of accountability to them. By the way, I had once I'd forgotten for some reason that General Michael Jackson commanded the Iraq operation, and he was giving this talk, a pretty much very similar talk to this, with this picture on. And he was sat in the front row, and I'm just laying into the generals who failed to do their duty. It's all great when they retire and all this. There he was, sat in the front row, and I kind of thought, well, he was a long time ago, he was Kosovo, and I just wasn't thinking. And anyway, come to the end, and folk come up afterwards, and he looms over, and he says, and this was at Cranwell, which is the RAF college, and they were setting up scaffolds outside for graduation for the young officers when they graduated. And he said, saw the photo picture there you put up of Bing. He's a paratrooper officer in the early 70s, so he's a very gruff, tough soldier. And I said, yes. And he said, no, did you put up some scaffolds outside? Is that for me? Because I forgot he was in Iraq. He was my commander, actually. Anyway, there we are. So that's the verse I was hinting at there, Kipling. So what then can we do about all this? What do I propose? What approaches can we take? So if anybody wants to look at that. No end of a lesson. It will do us no end of good. It did us no end of good. There was serious criticism of the British Army's performance after the Boer War. And something got done. Because people cared enough. I'm talking about people caring in the military. By the way, plenty of generals were fired during the Boer War as well. Okay, so one of the problems we had, and we can put right, I would suggest, is the problem of knowledge. That is to say, we don't know the political environments into which we plunged. That's pretty obvious to you, I would imagine. Things like the Maiwand thing, which the battle itself is interesting, but it's only indicative of the fact what we went into wasn't simply a country or a province, with historical enmities. It's as well something about the history into which you go. But the point is much wider and actually rather deeper than that. We didn't have any idea really until towards the end of this campaign the tribal makeups, where the tribal loyalties lay, the more recent history, the Soviet history, what the Soviets did, very similar to what we got up to, what the relevance of that was, what impact that had, the history, the tribal makeup, even to some extent the religious approaches, which are very significant actually, and we're still learning about where what we might call Islamic radicalism in Afghanistan actually comes from. What's the history of that? And only by identifying that, what some may say, can we begin to put that right. And that requires a knowledge, for example, of educational policy of the 1970s, some would say. So the problem, I'm not making a point about ancient battles, or I'm making a point about the ancient battles to indicate a much deeper lack of awareness of what's going on, which must inform high-level policy making. Deep knowledge must inform high-level policy making. I went to a seminar once in London at, I think the Oxford Research Group was conducting this seminar. It was led by a senior civil servant, and I was in Libya at the time. I was involved in another failed endeavour in Libya for the British government. I won't be getting involved anymore. And we were discussing that, and the question came up, did we know what we were doing in Libya? And why hadn't the government accessed the deep knowledge that some people have outside government of that part of the world? It's been involved there decades, commercially, journalistically, politically. You know, there's a lot of knowledge around. Why wasn't it drawn in? And the civil servant said, all right, look, we're not blind to this. We understand there's a problem, but here's my difficulty. I'm given an instruction at midday, and I've got to have an answer by 5 o'clock in the evening. I haven't got time to ring around. All I can do is what I can do. I haven't got time to convene a board of experts, because things have to move too quickly. And that applies, of course, across the board. And of course, with Iraq and Afghanistan, we're not fighting against formed military units. Our military is constructed, armed, its thought processes, Army, Navy and Air Force, are geared to fighting other armies, navies and air forces. The battle group, which is the core British Army unit, was constructed in the 1960s and 70s to fight a Soviet attack across the North German plains. It is armed from the kind of rifle you have to the kind of armoured person, to the mini tank that soldiers drive around in, to the construction and format of the military form. It is designed to fight other armies. So when you place these physical bodies, battle groups, battalions, brigades, platoons, fire teams, down to the very lowest level, designed to fight things like them into a military environment, and mindsets that are designed to fight against formed military units into a civilian context, you've got a problem. And it took 10 or 15 years in Northern Ireland to appreciate that problem, which they did. And it's taken us more than 10 years to realise that in Iraq and Afghanistan. So what do I suggest? To be pleased here, there's only about another 10 minutes to go. So here's my suggestions. As my commanders used to say, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. So here are my solutions. I'd be interested in yours. First thing, open networks. Access that expertise and knowledge that you're going to need should we have to intervene, stroke invade, stroke interfere in the future. Let's assume we are going to do that, and unfortunately we probably are. Be it our business to do so or not. Open networks means broaden your mind. That's what I'm getting at. And allied to that, encourage within the armed forces and without it real expertise. This is Professor Michael Howard. Just take a moment to read that. Okay, so his point is that what you think now is neither here nor there. What you need to be equipped with are the skills to be able to shift to thinking in a different way. And if nothing else, the last 10 years have shown us that. At the very lowest tactical levels, where commanders of 30 or 40 people or 100 people have started to have to become familiar with local religious practices and the politics of tribal areas of tribes going back centuries. So you need to have that flexibility. We need to encourage that, both at that level all the way up to the highest levels. And that kind of flexibility is not acquired in military staff colleges. It is acquired at places like this. Andrew Basovich is a superb... Have you met him, Matt?
Yeah, maybe.
I'd loved it. He's a hero of mine. Lieutenant Colonel in the American Army until 1991. Vietnam veteran and excellent writer. And I commend him to you. You may not agree with everything he says, I don't, but wonderful thinker and critical thinker. I would say as well, he would appreciate his son, in fact, was, and it has nothing to do with his thinking, his son was killed in Iraq as a US Marine officer. But he didn't shift his ground as a result of that. And there's old Petraeus, who, despite his discomfiture recently, is, I don't think one can doubt it. You met him?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. He's a thinker, okay? We may not agree with what he says or what he does. We may not believe that he won the Iraq War, and I certainly don't for what it's worth. But he was somebody who was prepared to accept, up to a point, beyond that point, critical thinking, and prepared to exercise. And that's particularly the case, he showed that particularly to be the case, by the way, not when he was commanding in Iraq, but when he commanded a division up where you come from, near there, Mosul actually, is where he commanded the 101st Airborne Division there. And it was a model deployment. It's the only successful American deployment, I would suggest, in the last 10 years. And he says that one of the reasons it was successful, and very few people doubt it was, peace was kept, the economy developed, security was pretty strong. It was the early days of Iraq, but it shifted extremely quickly when he left. I would suggest, and he suggested, one of the reasons that he and his team was so successful is because he had encouraged breadth of thinking and application of that thought within his divisional area, which is about, he had about 30,000 people under his command. And he has a PhD from Princeton. Now, many American officers have PhDs. Very few British officers have PhDs or master's degrees, save for the 8 Wednesday afternoons and a short dissertation that some of them do at Shriven. And these are the advantages. I'm not going to preach to you about this, or obviously you wouldn't be here if you didn't appreciate that. These are the advantages Petraeus suggests accrue to a critical graduate education. He recommends to every military officer. Civilian graduate military education, not a military graduate military education. In other words, in civilian environment, because there you're out of your comfort zone, you're going to be challenged. You're going to hear views you don't want to hear, and you haven't heard before. You're going to learn things you didn't know before. In his case, he spoke particularly about microeconomics, which I found very useful operations. And he learned to ask questions, which military officers don't learn to do. They answer questions. And there will come a time when others who perhaps are not particular, who are genuinely dangerous to us, I'm not mentioning any particular countries, but some countries have already appreciated the advantage of this kind of education. There are more American officers at British universities doing graduate degrees than there are British officers at British universities doing graduate degrees. There are more Chinese officers in American universities than there are American officers in American universities doing graduate degrees. And I'm given to understand by people who have been there quite recently that the Chinese officers are very, very commonly found at Iranian institutions of higher learning because they want to be familiar with environments in which they may work and which they may want to influence in the future. And then there's the so-called, and this leads into something else, and we're getting a bit more tactical now, a bit more down and dirty, white intelligence. White intelligence is open source intelligence. It's what you read in the papers every day. I'll give you an example, conscious of the time. I was hunting war criminals in 1997-98 in Bosnia. And of course the way we would do that usually is listening to signals intelligence and running agents and things like that and trying to get secret stuff out. And anyway, so we had a particular target, my team. Our target was a guy called, his name is Ledwidge, he's interested. Anyway, we were looking for him. And we went to see a particular senior police officer in northern Bosnia. And he says, "You're looking for Todorovic?" I said, "Well, I am." He said, "Do you know where he is?" I said, "No, we're looking for him, we want to know where he is." He said, "Do you read Blitz? Anybody here from former Yugoslavia? Okay, all right. Do you read Blitz or whatever it was? It's actually it's a Serbian newspaper, right?" I can't remember the title of the particular newspaper. It was a local newspaper anyway. And I said, well, yeah, we do sometimes, but not really. So I handed us a copy of it. He said, have a look at page 7. So I checked out page 7, and page 7, he said, look at the bottom. There at page 7 at the bottom was a headline. Hero reduced to penury, it said in Serbia. Colonel Stefan Todorovic has been reduced from his, the hero of the late war, has been reduced to poverty and living in a shack in whatever town it was in Serbia, can't remember, and patriots are asked to bear in mind the sacrifices of these kind of people, blah, 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 blah. There he was. And it was in a newspaper that we hadn't been reading. And we could have run all the agents we liked, listened through satellites to all the signals intelligence, and we would never have found that man living in a rotten old shack in the mountains of southern Serbia had this police officer not been reading the newspaper. To give you another example, more contemporary, an American base in eastern Afghanistan was being shelled regularly by the people they call the Taliban. And they were wondering why. They were building all the roads, they were doing all the hearts and minds stuff. Why are they shelling us? And it's only coming from one side. And it took 9 months for them to realise that they weren't being mortared and rocketed by the Pakistani Taliban. They were being mortared and rocketed because one particular, I'm simplifying the story here, because one village claimed the land they were on, and the other village took the rent. They were only paying rent to one village, whereas there was a land dispute over the land on which this American base was situated. And the people to whom they weren't paying the rent took exception to that because they felt the Americans had already decided whose land it was. It took 9 months of rocketing and shelling before somebody went out and asked, why are you shelling us? Entirely available. There's not secret intelligence, it's nothing. You don't need satellites and NSA to be able to get that kind of information. In fact, you're best without it. It has its place. But what General Flynn, who was General McChrystal's chief intelligence officer, says is you need to look to the open source before you go into the secret stuff. Finally, anybody want to guess where these guys come from? Look at uniform, can you see? You'll never get it. Okay, that's the general staff of the international brigades of the Republican Army in the Spanish Civil War. And this guy here was a young British guy. He's 24 years old, and he's the chief of staff. That means he organises everything. And Dunbar is his name, Michael Dunbar. And he threw an army of 100,000 men across the River Ebro, and he beat the fascist army, at least in the early stages of the battle, in 1938. During the Second World War, was he chief of staff of a British brigade or division, as somebody experienced at high levels of fighting very well organised fascist armies, Germans, Italians, Spanish? He was a corporal in the Royal Tank Regiment. And as somebody said in Parliament at the time, had Rommel been, this is about nothing at all, it's just a good story, but had Rommel been in the British Army, he wouldn't have got beyond the rank of sergeant. Which is probably true. I'll run past that and come to these guys finally. What am I talking about? I'm talking about finding the expertise you need and using it. Who are these? The Long Range Desert Group. Very good. They're not the SAS. These are the people that gave the SAS their initial reputation. The SAS was basically a bunch of very tough soldiers led by some public school dilettantes. Every mission who's failed until they hooked up with these guys who knew the desert, knew what they were doing. And they knew it because people like him, who founded the Long Range Desert Group, and who had deep knowledge of the desert, deep knowledge of the Egyptian, of Western Egypt, acquired for many years, accidentally ran into the early boys, the early men, the early officers of the SAS, accidentally. I won't cover off the details too much. It's a very interesting story. Point is, expertise was available, but expertise was not used. I'll cover him in questions, actually. There we go. That's it. Questions?